Hello and welcome to Mostly Vintage Cameras. This is a Canon T80, a 35mm SLR camera from the 1980s, and a very interesting camera indeed. Before we go into what it does and how to use it, I think I'd like to take a moment just to consider why it exists at all, because it is a very strange camera. It's not an L series lens with that red ring on. We'll come to the lens with this rather peculiar bolt-on bit at the side in due course. So, at around this time, this came out in '85, Canon had the Canon T70 on the market, and that was very advanced for the time. It had multi-exposure modes, including multiple program modes. It had multiple metering patterns, which was very unusual, a built-in winder, a very bright viewfinder, and Canon were doing good business with it. Now, a lot of what I'm going to say here is speculation on my part. I would imagine that the Canon executives in Japan would have known the T90 was just a year or two away down the road, and that the EOS all-conquering range would have been a little bit behind that. So everything was coming up roses in the Canon garden. And then Minolta did this. The Minolta 7000 AF, or Maxim AF as I believe it was called, or possibly Maxim 7000 in some markets. Also a very interesting camera. Very radical design for the period, all these push buttons and so forth, even more so perhaps than the T70 was. But crucially, this was, for all practical purposes, the first 35mm SLR camera that offered a viable autofocus system and had the ecosystem of lenses and flash units and other accessories to make it a viable camera. So suddenly Canon and everybody else were selling manual focus cameras in what had become overnight an autofocus world. Even though Canon executives would most likely have known the T90 was going to be a runaway success and that the EOS was going to be a better product, or the EOS 650, the first one, was going to be a better product than Minolta, the reality is once people had bought into the Minolta system, they bought the 7000 body, they bought a couple of lenses, maybe a flash unit, they could be looking at having invested, maybe as much as £1,000, certainly over 500 by that point. And that was a lot of money in the mid-80s. And once somebody's invested in a system, it's very hard to get them out of it. So if you have a loyal customer base with an AV1, an AE1 program, perhaps even a T70, if they decide they want autofocus and they switch to Minolta, then you're not going to be able to sell them an EOS just a couple of years later, because they already have invested all their money in that Minolta outfit, and they'll want to see obviously a return on that investment. So my guess is that in an effort to stem the tide of customers going over to Minolta, Canon showed a little ankle. They produced a camera which uses the FD mount, so there's a lens release just here, just like any other FD mount, but they added these gold pins and they put a motor in, or perhaps I should say attached a motor to the side of the lens, and they made a kind of autofocus camera. I don't believe they ever expected to sell huge numbers of these, and I suspect the idea was that they could say to their existing customer base, if you like an autofocus camera, you don't have to sell your existing camera, you don't have to sell all your FD lenses and lose all the money on those. We can give you a T80 which gives you autofocus, takes your existing lenses, albeit in manual focus, and whilst Canon, to the best of my knowledge, never said that this was the first of a range of FD autofocus cameras, as far as I'm aware they never disavowed anybody of that belief either. So they're kind of hedging their bets, showing a little ankle, showing what the future might look like, at least if you didn't go to Minolta. Right, well, with all that being said, let's put some batteries in the camera and we'll see what it actually does. Now, I started off by saying this was a very interesting camera, but let's not confuse interesting with high performance, high specification. I did run a roll of film through this and it was great fun. I enjoyed it tremendously, but it is what it is. So when it comes to the batteries, we hit upon the first problem. This is the first T80 I bought. It had some battery corrosion in when I bought it. Many people will be pleased to learn, I'm sure, it runs on AAA batteries, AAA alkaline cells, but I'm not a big fan of those myself because they do tend to corrode if they're left in the camera. This had some battery corrosion. It worked well enough after I cleaned it to run a roll of film through, but then when I got the films commercially developed and got them back, it was no longer functional. So I had to go and buy a second one. Now, on the eBay listing for this camera, it did show it with the LCD lit up, so it was obviously working. There was power getting through to the circuits. However, this also has battery corrosion. So let's see how far we get. To open the battery cover, you push this thumb twist or this thumb knob, press it in, and it pops out a little bit. I find it easier at this point just to turn the camera upside down, and this becomes much easier to take out. If you try and take the battery cover off from the top this way up, it's quite fiddly. Now, as I say, it's 4 AAA batteries. Get these in the right way. 2. There's 3. And there's 4. You can see there's a very clear diagram in the battery compartment where they're meant to go. And this sits back on the base, other way around. And you just do that little catch up again. And there it is. And hopefully, when I move the power switch to the A position, the activated position, yep, this all lights up. We can see there's a Viewfinder display right there that shows program. So let's go ahead and look at the features of this, and let's start with the lens. So as I previously mentioned, this is an FD mount, but it's got this augmentation of the gold pins. So these are running current and also some kind of instruction to turn the dial that way or turn the dial that way, the focus ring. It's using in the camera a CCD device, charge couple device, to detect contrast. As the contrast increases, the current being produced by the CCD also increases, and when it gets its peak current or its peak contrast, it decides it's in focus. It's a linear CCD, so it's not like a square chip, it's just one bar. This sounds to me very much like a system developed by Leica, of all people. Leica were going to launch an autofocus, I can't remember if it was an R3 or an R4, which had that autofocus system on it. They decided, having invented it, that their customers weren't really interested in gimmicky things like autofocus, so they sold the technology, ironically perhaps, to Minolta. A lot of Leica cameras, the R3 in particular, and to a degree the R4, were based on Minolta models, and Minolta and Leica had a long-standing technical partnership. So it does seem that that style of technology, I'm not saying it's exactly the same, or it's even remotely the same, it just seems reminiscent to me of that style of technology. So if we look at the side of the lens here, we've got a Canon zoom lens, AC 35-70mm, and it's an f3.5 to 4.5 lens made in Japan. Now, at the time in the 80s, people did suggest that this camera and lens were being handmade rather than on a regular mass production line. I suspect the truth is it was made on a low volume production line, which was more labour intensive, and that very short period that it was sold for, just that 1 year or so, I think possibly, and again this is just speculation, means they did one production run and it took a year for them to sell, at which point they said, let's discontinue now. So we've got switch controls on this switch, which we're probably quite familiar with from modern cameras now. One shot or single autofocus, servo, which is what we would call continuous autofocus, and later Canon cameras and lenses had AI or artificial intelligence servo, and manual focus. Manual focus, there's two cutouts on the filter thread here, and that's how you turn the manual focus ring. It's not ideal. The reality is the autofocus system on this camera isn't good, to be blunt. Servo autofocus, you're not going to be able to track somebody walking towards you or away from you, for example. The zoom is operated from this lever here, this 35 to 70 zoom range, which is a very strange thing. It's kind of a bit reminiscent of some cine lenses in actual fact. And also looking at the lens, there is a filter thread here, actually recessed in. Let me just zoom that out. Oh, no, it doesn't zoom out any further. So if you wanted to use something like a polarizing filter on this, you'd have to get your fingers inside the lens to try and turn it, which is going to be less than ideal. So perhaps a bit of a compromised design in order to get that autofocus motor in there. It's amazing how they went from this to the EOS, where the motor's also in the lens, and the difference in the EOS EF lenses is phenomenal. Now let's just pop this back on the camera. Now we looked at this little zoom lever, and whilst it is in a strange place, when you're using the camera it's actually surprisingly ergonomic to operate the zoom with that lever. It was much more convenient than I thought it was going to be perfectly honest with you. So that's quite nice. But let's have a look at this top plate. We can see we've got the program mode, and if we press the mode dial and we move this shifter, we get a range of symbols on the dial without very much explanation. And what I would like to do is just read to you the introduction from the Canon instruction book for this camera, because it does give a bit of a clue as to what Canon were thinking. Introduction. Today we live in an age where much of our information comes to us through visual images. The news on TV and in newspapers, advertisements in magazines and on billboards all use pictures. You may not realise it, but these photographs can be differentiated according to which shooting technique was used to take them. Canon has classified these various techniques into 5 different types, assigned each a symbolic pictograph, and designed a camera with which you can take a photo by choosing a pictograph. So Canon are saying, if you want a blurry background, we've got a blurry background mode. If you want a faster shutter speed for sports, we've got a sports mode. Also, incidentally, very similar to the blurry background mode. So let's look at this display again in light of that description. So program mode is a standard program mode. It'll choose the aperture and shutter speed. This is also, and one of the reasons why the camera is interesting, one of the first cameras to use pictographs. I think this is the first time Canon used a pictograph name or word on any of their products. It's also using a slider control rather than the up-down push button control that the T70 had. So we're kind of in an intermediary technology where we've got an autofocus camera, but it's not quite fully finished, let's say. We've got the ideas of pictograms and pictographs and that sort of visual representation of how you would choose the exposure mode, and we're moving away from all push buttons, and whilst we haven't got to the command dial yet, we're moving towards a more perhaps fluid slider control. So I think this is one of the reasons the camera is so interesting. But anyway, standard program. We've then got what Canon call, get this right, deep focus mode. So this is intended to pick a smaller a smaller aperture to increase your depth of field. We've then got a little running man. This is the stop action mode, or I should say stop action mode, for sports and that sort of thing, or the indeed grandchildren running around the back garden. There's a shallow focus mode. The camera's going to choose a wider aperture to throw the background out of focus. Of course, that's going to give us a faster shutter speed, which is also what the sports mode does, or the stop action mode. So the stop action mode and the shallow focus mode are actually very similar. Now the last mode is this one, which is the running guy with lines in the background and the letter or the number 30 underneath it. At first glance it doesn't make a lot of sense. This is the Canon flowing mode, and the idea is it is essentially shutter priority or time value. So you can choose your shutter speed. We've got 125th, a 60th, 30th, 15th and back to 125th. The idea is you would choose a slower shutter speed and you would pan the camera while you took the photograph. Giving you well, a blurry background, a flowing streaky background. And I took a couple of photographs in that mode as best I could under the circumstances. The flowing mode, interesting they called it flowing and not shutter priority, or who knows what else they would have called it, but it is in reality shutter priority. You choose a shutter speed, albeit from a limited selection, and the camera will choose an appropriate aperture. Now there's also a beeper. We can see the little beeper symbol down here in the corner of the display. And we've also got an ISO setting, so this doesn't use DX coding. You do have to remember to set the film speed yourself based on the film you put in there. And as you press the ISO button, you'll see the number of the ISO comes up here. That's almost all there is to it on the top plate. We've got battery check. 3 bars is a full battery, 2-1 gives you about a third of the power remaining each time. Very standard sort of a thing, exactly the same in fact as on the T70. If we look at the body in more detail, we can sort of imagine that this section is straight off of the T70, but the T70 ran on 2 batteries. I think they were AA's, not AA's, so they've bolted on this battery box on the base plate, and because the T70 batteries went in effectively into the hand grip, they've redesigned this hand grip a little bit as well. They've ended up putting this strap plug here on the grip, so as you're holding the camera you're sort of manoeuvring your fingers around the strap. It's a very unusual way of doing things. Last few controls on the camera itself. On the on-off switch is also the self-timer, and that's when you get the beeper as well. Just wait for that to count down. That sounds just like a T70. And then film rewind. So to rewind the film, you press this button and move this slider across at the same time, and it will rewind the film. It doesn't, I don't believe, have automatic film rewind. So that's pretty much all the control. There's just one more left, which is hidden just in here. You can't really see it very well. Try and get a better. There we go. This here is a 1.5 stop or plus 1.5 stop exposure compensation button. So if this is an average center weighted average metering pattern. So if you've got a lot of sky in a landscape, or people wearing a very white wedding dress, they're likely to come out too dark. So you've got exposure compensation. So film loading, let's take a look at that. Standard fare for a camera of this sort. Film goes in this side, little orange marker on this side shows you where the film leader goes. don't have to be too careful with this. And we can see we get the 3 bars that were the battery check are now confirming the film is moving through the camera correctly. And we've got a film cassette icon there as well. So that's pretty much all there is to the EOS. Let's just pop that on autofocus. You can see the lens wire in and out. That actually worked pretty well. Sometimes it achieves autofocus reasonably swiftly and accurately, and sometimes it will just hunt and hunt. So a few basics on the specifications. The ISO range is between 12 and 1600. So if you want to use those interesting films like ATOX 50 or CMS 20, Pan F, that sort of thing, the very slow ISO films, you can certainly do that. Flip side of the coin, of course, is that you're maxing out at 1600, and without an exposure compensation dial, there's not really very much you can do about that. Flash synchronization is at a 90th of a second. If you use a dedicated flash unit, it will automatically set the 90th of a second shutter speed, and it will set the auto aperture. You'll also get a lightning strike symbol in the viewfinder when the flash is charged. All very standard stuff. It does technically have manual and what you might call aperture priority. Manual, however, is both of those modes are limited to using standard FD, not the FD-AC lenses. So the standard manual mode is limited to a 60th of a second or bulb, so just the 2 settings there. And the auto exposure, if you take the standard FD lens off the A setting, you get stop down auto exposure. So it does it, it's okay, it works, nothing wrong with that. There were only 3 lenses, 3 FD-AC lenses made for this camera, a 50mm, this 35 to 70, and I believe the other was a 75 to 200. That's basically the camera. Now I'd like you to do me a couple of favours if you're still watching this video. The first one is go and buy a T80. They're terrific fun to use. Don't expect them to be photographing your child's rugby team or the school play or anything. It's just not up to that. But as a walk around holiday camera or something of that nature, it's a hoot. Also, I want enthusiasts to buy T80s to take the batteries out in storage and hopefully preserve them for future generations. The other thing that I'd be grateful for you if you would do is, you know what I'm going to say, click on that subscribe button just down there. Thank you very much. It does make a difference to us, or to me I should say. Let's take a look at some photographs. As I say, I did run a roll of film through this. It was a roll of Ilford XP2, and I did try to use all the exposure modes. So let's have a little look what we've got. So the first photograph I took with it was this pub sign. And this pub sign is a very sort of pastel green in the robes of the, I suppose it's the king. So I think it's done a very nice job of capturing the contrast between the dark black writing, the pastel green of the robes, and the whitewash of the wall. That's sort of at the 35 end, and then this is at the 35 end, so you're getting a bit more of a range there. 35-70 isn't a big range, obviously, but it's quite a good quality lens. You can make a 35-70 that's good quality at a reasonable price. If you want to get a bigger zoom range, you really have to essentially pay more money or sacrifice on the quality a little bit. This again is the 70mm. If you want to take a detail such as this AED, public AED box, and then if you want to show it in context, there is enough of a difference between the two extremes. So obviously 70 is twice 35, so it's a 2 times or 2 to 1 zoom, but it's a useful range. Many people of course would, if they could, opt for the 50mm. Now this is modern Britain, with the Union flag in the foreground and the Indian curry house in the background. That really pretty much sums up the UK mentality, multicultural and proud to be British. So this is the standard program mode. I took a similar shot using the flowing mode. Now the flowing mode, of course, is meant for panning moving subjects, but if you choose a slower shutter speed, this was a 15th, definitely pushing my luck with hand holding this, but you can add a little bit more interest in the image with the blurry flags in the breeze. Talking of the flowing mode, let's take a look at a couple of attempts I made to use it. One is a motorcyclist going that way. As you can see, the cyclist or the motorcyclist more or less sharp, whilst the foreground and background have that motion blur, so it gives an impression of speed. And then the other one was a motorcyclist going the other way. These are just general photographs in the local churchyard. That's again at the 35mm end of the zoom range, and again at the 70mm. So again, a useful range, nothing too dramatic. Now here's some foliage overhanging a footpath, which was quite nice. That's the regular centre weighted average exposure, and then here it is again with the plus 1.5 stop exposure compensation. And you can see it sort of really makes the lighter leaves in the middle pop out a little bit more. This is just a floral display in the high street. It sort of shows the shadow focus mode, but of course with the subject distance differential that much, it's always going to give you that sort of effect, but quite nice nonetheless. Here's some 1950s graffiti on the local church wall. I think that says 1957. I don't know if that was a thing back then. A little cafe with its planter there. This was the Jubilee year, of course, and these were taken only about a week before the sad passing of Queen Elizabeth II. So there was certainly a certain amount of literally bunting about and that sort of stuff. And there's some bunting. So there you have it. That's the Canon T80. I wouldn't recommend it as your only camera or your main camera, but if you've got around about 40 or 50 pounds, which seems to be the going rate for them, some go for as much as £100, and they tend to be the ones that are advertised as being film tested or having a warranty, and it really depends on how brave you are as to whether you go for the cheaper ones, no returns, no warranty, or the more expensive ones. But if you have that sort of money spare and you want an interesting camera to take the odd roll of film in, it's well worth it, in my opinion. These photographs, of course, were black and white. Some people do ask when I post black and white pictures. Yes, it's entirely possible to put a colour film in, and you would obviously get colour photographs that would be equally sharp, but of course just in colour. Anyway, thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. I hope that's been of interest or use to somebody, and do have a good day.